Anthony had always believed that a good life was a quiet life, measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the relentless rhythm of the seasons. His farm, nestled in a lowland valley, where the rice fields stretched out like emerald oceans, was his sanctuary and his burden. He was a man of routines, and for 20 years, the most fixed point in his landscape was the Scarecrow standing sentinel in the center of the main paddy. Anthony had named it Silent Sam, a crude, T-shaped crucifix of sun-bleached wood, stuffed with old hay, and given a head fashioned from a flour sack that sagged permanently into a grim, unblinking frown. It was mid-October. The air had taken on the crisp, metallic scent of impending harvest, and the rice stalks were heavy with grain. Anthony had been out since dawn, inspecting a patch near the irrigation ditch. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and blood red, Anthony paused. He took a long draught of cool air, turning to admire his crop, when a hairline fracture of unease split the calm evening. Silent Sam looked different. It wasn't the clothes. The faded denim shirt and torn overalls were the same. It wasn't the posture. The arms were still outstretched in their eternal, hopeless plea against the crows. It was the angle. Anthony was sure, with the cold, absolute certainty of a man who saw the same image daily, that Silent Sam had been facing due west, toward the setting sun. Now, the sackcloth head was tilted ever so slightly, pointing southwest, directly toward the small wooden shed where he kept his tools. Wind, he thought immediately, dismissing the shiver running down his spine. The twine holding the head must have loosened. He squinted. There was no wind. The tall rice stalks were perfectly motionless, reflecting the quiet sky. He walked over, his boots sinking into the wet mud with soft, sucking sounds. It was solid, deep in the earth. He reached up and straightened the head, giving it a firm twist to the north. "Stay put, Sam," he muttered, the sound echoing strangely in the sudden quiet. He retired to his farmhouse, ate a solitary meal, and slept. The next morning, the sun was just breaching the eastern hills when Anthony walked back out. He stopped dead at the lip of the field. Silent Sam's head was again facing the southwest. And this time, it wasn't just tilted. The head was rotated completely, the stitched face staring directly at the farmhouse kitchen window, the very window Anthony was looking out of moments before. A knot of pure dread cinched in Anthony's stomach. This was beyond the wind. He strode across the field, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't touch the pole this time. He just stood before the Scarecrow, looking up into the unseeing black buttons sewn where eyes should be. "How?" he whispered. The head moved. It wasn't a sudden, jarring shift. It was slow, deliberate, and sickeningly fluid. Like an oiled hinge turning, it rotated away from the farmhouse, sweeping past the north, and came to rest facing Anthony. It was now looking down at him. Anthony stumbled backward, landing hard on his rear in the mud. He scrabbled to his feet, eyes fixed on the figure. The Scarecrow remained still, its shadow long and distorted in the morning light, but the change had occurred. The head, which should have been rigidly fixed, was swiveling freely, observing him. Fear, cold and sharp as a scythe, drove him back to the house. He locked the doors, drew the blinds, and sat by the kitchen table, clutching a rusty hunting rifle he hadn't fired in a decade. For 2 days, he didn't leave the house. He peered through the slats of the blinds. Silent. Sam didn't move during the day, standing stiff and still, but the direction of its gaze kept shifting. One afternoon, it was looking east. By sundown, it was facing the back porch. It was patrolling, watching the perimeter of his life. On the third night, Anthony woke to a sound that shouldn't exist. The soft, rhythmic squish, squish, squish of something heavy moving through the shallow water of the rice field. He crept to the window, forcing himself to lift the blind just enough to see. The moon was full, a monstrous silver disk hanging low in the inky sky, bathing the field in an ethereal pale light. And in that light, Silent Sam was no longer silent and no longer still. It was walking. not stumbling, not swaying in the wind, but walking with a slow, heavy, purposeful gait. The hay-stuffed arms were no longer rigid. They were hanging loose, swaying slightly with each long, wet step. The sackcloth head, tilted back now, seemed to be sniffing the air like a predator tracking prey. The squish, squish, squish was the sound of its heavy wooden feet pulling out of the thick mud. It was walking the circumference of the paddy, maintaining a perfect, slow patrol. But the terrifying part was the occasional pause. Every few minutes, it would stop, turn its crude head toward the house, and stand utterly still for a span of 30 seconds, as if counting or waiting for a sign. Anthony sank back against the wall, dry-mouthed. This wasn't a spirit. This was a physical thing, animated by something vile and patient. The next morning, Silent Sam was back in the center of the field, staked exactly where it had always been. But its old denim shirt was ripped at the shoulder, revealing a patch of darkly stained hay, and the right hand, the one that had always been limp, was now curled, the straw fingers bent into a grasping, claw-like gesture. Anthony knew he couldn't leave it there. He had to burn it, bury it, destroy it. He waited until dusk, gathering every ounce of his courage. Rifle in hand, he forced himself out the door and approached the figure, moving as silently as he could. When he reached the Scarecrow, he raised the rifle, aiming at the sackcloth head. "It ends now, Sam," he croaked. He didn't pull the trigger. As he looked closer, he saw that the sackcloth head was glistening. It was wet and dark, not with dew, but with something thick and viscous. And then, Silent Sam moved for the last time. It didn't walk. It didn't turn. The hay-stuffed body shuddered, and the two stiff wooden cross members holding the shirt and overalls groaned. Slowly, excruciatingly slowly, the sackcloth head began to smile. The twine holding the mouth tight snapped, and the stitched frown pulled back, revealing a gap where the hay stuffing had been. Only it wasn't hay Anthony was seeing now. It was wet, dark soil, packed tightly inside, and something else. Tiny, iridescent white fragments, like crushed bone. The smile grew impossibly wide, revealing the entire cavity, and a deep guttural sound, like water being sucked into a drain, escaped the opening. The voice was rough, dry, and terrifyingly close. "I only move when you watch, Anthony," the Scarecrow whispered. "I only feed when you sleep." Anthony dropped the rifle. He didn't scream. He simply turned and ran, not back to the house, but toward the distant, invisible hills, away from the field, away from the farm, away from the thing that had been guarding his crops for 20 years. He never returned. But the farm stood there, waiting, and every farmer in the surrounding villages would later swear. When the harvest moon was full, you could sometimes see a faint, flickering light in the center of the abandoned rice paddy, always moving, always watching, always waiting for a new crop to tend. Francis shouldn't have taken the route through the valley. It was 1:47 a.m., and the state road, barely wider than a gravel track in places, was swallowed by a mist that felt less like water vapor and more like a heavy refrigerated gas. The low beams of his old Volvo cut through the gloom, illuminating nothing but the immediate sweep of asphalt and the unending, skeletal rows of harvested cornfields that pressed in from both sides. Francis was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from a double shift, and his mind was playing tricks on him. Every black shadow looked like a deer. Every rustle of dry stalk sounded like footsteps. He was reaching for the thermos in his cup holder, eyes momentarily off the road, when the car's headlights finally settled on something that did not belong. Francis slammed on the brakes, the seatbelt biting into his chest. The Volvo squealed, the sound deafening in the profound silence of the countryside, and skidded to a stop barely 10 feet from the obstacle. It was a Scarecrow. Not one of those jolly rustic bundles, but something enormous, looming, and utterly wrong. It stood squarely in the center of his lane, a sentinel blocking the road. Its burlap head, stretched taut and stained dark with dew, was cocked at a strange, unnatural angle. Two mismatched yellowed buttons, one large, one small, were sewn crudely where eyes should be, fixing him with a chilling, unfocused gaze. The arms were too long, stiffly wired into a permanent crucifix posture, draped in a sodden, threadbare coat. It smelled even inside the car like old hay, wet soil, and something sickly sweet, like decaying fruit. Francis's first thought was annoyance. Teenagers. A stupid, dangerous prank. His heart was hammering not from terror, but from adrenaline and anger. He put the car in park, fished his phone out, no signal naturally, and sighed. He had to move it. He opened the door, and the chill of the valley air hit him, instantly raising goosebumps. The silence outside was absolute. The mist swirled around the Scarecrow's feet, making it look like it was floating just above the asphalt. He approached cautiously. Up close, the thing was gargantuan. It was easily 7 feet tall. He could see the thick wooden post driven up through its torso, anchoring it to the ground. He reached out to grab the thick canvas shoulder and hesitated. There was something about the density of it, the way the ragged coat draped, that suggested weight far exceeding straw and sticks. It felt like solid muscle underneath the fabric. Francis took a deep breath, muttered, "Just wood and hay, Francis. Get it together," and wrapped both hands around the central post. He pulled. It didn't budge. He pulled again, harder, bracing his feet. Nothing. The post was driven deep into the asphalt, or maybe the ground beneath it, as if planted with unnatural force. Frustrated, he stepped back, intending to look for a rock to knock the buttons out of its face. As he did, he glanced down at the ground near its feet. The mist was thick, but he saw something. Not a rock, but a small, neat pile of dark, matted feathers. He looked back up at the face. The oversized button eye seemed to catch the reflected light of his car headlights, and for one terrifying, impossible second, Francis swore the angle of the Scarecrow's head had shifted, just marginally. It was looking down the length of its immense, stiff arm, pointing directly at the endless black cornfield. Francis scrambled back to the car, fumbling the lock. He threw it into drive and floored the accelerator, not caring that he had to steer the Volvo off the road and half throttle through the muddy shoulder to get around the thing. The Scarecrow was left behind in a diminishing swirl of fog. He drove faster than he should have, heart still pounding, trying to rationalize what he had seen. The shifted head must have been his imagination, a trick of the mist. The density? Wet wood, frozen soil. The feathers? A hawk got unlucky. He drove for another 3 minutes, his anxiety slowly morphing back into fatigue. The road was still black, still flanked by cornfields. He started scanning the mile markers, desperate for the sign for his hometown ridge point. He came around a soft bend and his breath hitched, a sharp, painful gasp. There it was again, standing precisely in the center of the lane, exactly where he had seen it before, was the Scarecrow. But it was different. It wasn't just standing, it was leaning. The burlap head was now tilted even further, resting against the collar of its coat as if posing for him. And instead of the scattered pile of feathers, there was a single, fresh, red smear on the asphalt at its feet. Francis didn't stop this time. He didn't even brake. He screamed a raw, strangled sound that tore his throat and swerved violently onto the opposite shoulder, gravel spitting wildly as he shot past. In his rearview mirror, illuminated by the rapidly fading taillights, he saw it clearly. The thing wasn't anchored to the ground. It was turning. Slowly, deliberately, the enormous figure rotated on its axis, tracking his movement until its button eyes were staring straight back down the road at the retreating Volvo. He drove the rest of the night in a blind panic, speedometer needle buried, not caring about deer, ditches, or state troopers. Hours later, as the first bruised light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in sickly shades of gray and yellow, the terrain finally shifted. The cornfields gave way to tired suburban homes, and Francis slowed down, shaking uncontrollably, but feeling the first fragile sense of relief. He had made it. The city limits sign for Ridgepoint finally appeared, solid and reassuring. He pulled onto his quiet, tree-lined street, relieved to see his own familiar house, the porch light glowing amber. He drove up the driveway and killed the engine. The resulting silence was not the oppressive void of the valley, but a comfortable, morning quiet. Francis leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes, letting the tension drain away. A second later, his eyes snapped open. The relief had vanished, replaced by a cold, leaden certainty. He didn't need to look in the rearview mirror, but he did anyway. Perched on the hood ornament of his Volvo, sitting less than 2 feet from his face, was a single yellowed button. It was exactly the same size as the small, mismatched button that had been sewn into the Scarecrow's right eye. Then, through the windshield, his gaze lifted to the porch. There, leaning against the front door, enormous and silent in the weak morning light, was the Scarecrow. Its arms were no longer held in a crucifix. They were hanging loosely at its sides, and its burlap head was tilted forward, as if it was patiently waiting for him to step out of the car. But its eyes were wrong. Both buttons were gone. Now, only 2 dark, perfectly round holes stared back from the sagging cloth, and the hay inside seemed to have been replaced by a wet, shifting shadow. Francis put the car in reverse, but the engine only ground a slow, painful grind. The old Blackwood farm stood a lonely, skeletal sentinel against the dying summer light. Its legend was the kind whispered over flickering phone screens at sleepovers, the kind that drew thrill-seekers, despite the genuine chill that seemed to emanate from its warped timber and rusted silos. Natasha, all nervous energy and flashing excitement, gripped the steering wheel of her beat-up sedan. Rose, quieter and more analytical, checked the time on her phone. It was 8:15 p.m., officially past twilight. "Okay, Tasha, 1 hour," Rose murmured, adjusting the flashlight beam. "We get the photos, we verify the rumors about the seller, and we are gone. No heroics." "Please," Natasha scoffed, pulling the car onto the cracked gravel driveway. The silence that instantly enveloped them felt heavy, suffocating. This is Blackwood Farm, not the Texas Chainsaw Massacre set. It's just old, smelly, and probably full of mice. The main house was a 2-story farmhouse, graying and defeated, its porch sagging like a broken jaw. They slipped through the front door, which hung loosely on a single hinge, introducing them to air thick with dust, rot, and the metallic tang of old moisture. They moved through the ground floor, their flashlights cutting narrow cones through the oppressive dark. Every floorboard screamed under their weight. In the kitchen, a calendar from 1987 hung stiffly, the dates circled in fading ink. A sense of displacement hung over everything, as if the residents hadn't left, but had simply vanished mid-sentence. "It feels wrong," Rose whispered in the living room, pointing to a rocking chair that gently swayed in the imperceptible draft. "Like something is still waiting." Natasha, determined to dismiss the dread, headed toward the back door. "Come on, let's check the barn. That's where the real decay is." The barn was monumental, a hollow cavern of wood and shadow. They found rusted farming equipment, cobweb-draped saddles, and stacks of hay that had long since turned into compost. High above, through gaps in the roof, tiny slivers of the moonless sky provided no comfort. It was when they were exiting the barn and heading back toward the house that Rose stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. "Tasha, look!" Beyond the farmhouse, stretching into the gloom, was the farm's most prominent feature, a vast, unharvested cornfield. The stalks were dry and brittle, reaching higher than their heads, rustling with an unnerving sandpaper sound in the barely there wind. And centered in the field, just on the edge of the nearest rows, stood the Scarecrow. It wasn't a charming, friendly effigy. Its head was a weathered burlap sack, tied crudely with twine, lacking any painted features. It was dressed in ragged, dark clothing, its arms stretched out on a rough wooden crossbeam. But what made Rose freeze was not its appearance, but its posture. Unlike a typical scarecrow, which is usually stiff and fixed, this one seemed to lean forward almost intently, as if peering at them from beneath its floppy straw hat. "Okay, that's actually unsettling," Natasha admitted, her voice low. She fumbled for her phone to take a picture, the bravado fading. It's like someone designed it to look evil. Rose didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed on the shape. Tasha, she finally managed, her voice a strained wire. Did you see it move? No, Rosie, it's a statue. Your nerves are playing up. The wind probably shifted the... No, not the arms, the body. I swear it was facing the house when we drove up. Now it's facing us. The thought was instantly terrifying because it was just plausible enough. The shadows, the distance, the flickering beam of the flashlight. It could be a trick of the eye. But as they both stood paralyzed, observing the motionless, leaning figure, the unsettling feeling crystallized into pure terror. A sound, not from the dry stalks, but from the gravel beneath the Scarecrow's feet, reached them. A slow, heavy scrape. The Scarecrow moved. It wasn't a quick, supernatural teleportation. It was a jerky, deliberate shift. The crossbar that formed its shoulders tilted, and its sack head rotated with a sickening friction. Then it lifted one of its heavy, straw-stuffed legs and took a single, slow step off its stand and onto the dry earth. Natasha didn't scream. She didn't have time. The sheer violation of natural law was a physical blow. The figure was moving toward them, its gait an unnatural, stiff-legged stagger, like a puppet whose strings were manipulated by a psychopath. It made no sound other than the slow, dragging scrape of its massive boots on the dirt. "Run, Tasha, now!" Rose shrieked, finally breaking the spell. They bolted, scrambling back toward the car parked at the end of the long driveway. Rose kept glancing back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Scarecrow was covering ground surprisingly fast, its long, gangly limbs making huge, uneven strides. They reached the sedan, Natasha fumbling violently with the car door, her hands slick with sweat. Rose was already in the passenger seat, screaming, "Go! Go!" Natasha jammed the key into the ignition. The engine groaned once, twice, and then caught with a cough. She slammed the gear shift into reverse and spun the wheel, sending the car sliding sideways in the gravel. But as the headlights swept across the yard, they illuminated something horrifyingly close. The Scarecrow was no longer staggering. It was running, its straw-stuffed arms flapping wildly, its speed impossible for its clumsy form. It cleared the space between the cornfield and the car in 2 horrific leaps. "It's coming around," Rose yelled, pointing to the driver's side. Natasha floored the accelerator, but the car was still maneuvering back. In the side mirror, she saw the burlap head, now impossibly close, filling the entire frame. Then came a deafening thud that rattled the chassis and shattered the driver's side window. The air filled with the stench of old burlap and mildewed straw. Something long, wooden, and tipped, with a rusty nail, slammed through the opening where the window had been, grazing Natasha's shoulder. It was the Scarecrow's arm, detached from its shoulder, but still animated, reaching out like a grotesque, separate entity. Natasha screamed, jerking the wheel. The car shot forward, connecting with a rotten fence post which splintered with a crack. Rose pulled Natasha down, shielding her from the shards of glass and the whipping limb. The car fishtailed onto the narrow dirt road, leading away from the farm. As they gained speed, the detached arm finally fell away, striking the road with a hollow thunk. Natasha didn't look in the rearview mirror, but Rose couldn't help herself. The Scarecrow stood where the driveway met the road. It looked incomplete, one arm missing, but it was perfectly still, watching them disappear. Then, very slowly, as if waving a final, terrible goodbye, it reached up with its remaining tattered hand and touched the empty socket where its other arm had been. Natasha drove without speaking for 20 minutes until they hit the lights of the highway. When they finally pulled over, trembling, Rose looked at her friend. Natasha's shoulder was bleeding lightly where the rusty nail had grazed her. "We need to call the police," Rose whispered, tears welling up. Natasha shook her head, staring blankly ahead. "And tell them what, Rose?" "That a stuffed doll chased us with its own severed arm." They never spoke of the Blackwood farm again, but the horror settled deep inside them, a seed of irrational fear that took root. Every time the wind rustled the dry leaves in autumn, or every time they saw a lonely figure in the periphery, they remembered the slow, deliberate footsteps of the thing made of straw and wood that had defied everything they knew about the world and walked right off its post to hunt them.